A small oil lamp sits on a flat stone shelf cut into a wall. The wall is wet. The room is below ground, beneath a hill in the city of Rome, and the air in it has not been warm for months. An old man sits on the stone floor with a piece of parchment across his knees. His eyesight is bad. It has been bad for years. He leans close to the lamp. He is writing a letter. He is writing to a young friend far away, and the letter is mostly practical. He wants the friend to come. He wants the friend to come quickly. He wants the friend to come before winter because the cell is going to get colder and there is a cloak he had to leave behind in a town up the coast, and he would like the cloak back. He would also like the books, especially the parchments. The man writing the letter has been in this room before, years ago. Different chain, different emperor. He got out then. He is not going to get out this time. He knows it. The last people to share the cell with him are mostly gone. One of them, a man whose name was warm in his earlier letters, has walked away. Demas has deserted me, the old man writes, because he loved this present world. Only one friend is still with him, a quiet physician. The old man writes the man's name simply. Only Luke is with me. The lamp flickers. He keeps writing. You don't know yet who this man is. You do not know yet whose chain is on his wrist, or whose cloak is sitting in a stranger's house in a port town called Troas. You do not know yet that this letter, this small practical letter about cloaks and books and friends and winter, is the last letter this man will ever write. We will come back to this room, but before we do, you have to understand something. This man wrote 13 letters that ended up in the Bible. Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, novels, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, 1 Timothy, Titus, 2 Timothy, 13 letters. They are not arranged in the Bible in the order he wrote them. They are arranged mostly by length. The longest first, the shortest last, which means we read his life backwards. Today, we are not going to do that. Today, we are going to read them the way he wrote them, in order, one by one, anchored to the exact moment in his life when his hand picked up the pen. A city he had just escaped, a friend who was dying, a church he had to leave under threat of stoning, a chain on his wrist, a cold dungeon, a cloak he could not get back. This is not a study of Paul's theology. This is not a survey of his doctrine. This is not a Bible course you sit through. This is a story about 13 pieces of urgent mail written by a real man at 13 breaking points of one of the most violent lives in early Christianity. Read in order, the way he wrote them, the way nobody ever reads them. Stay with me. So let us go back to the beginning, not the beginning of the Bible, the beginning of his pen. The year is around 48, perhaps 49. Paul is in the city of Antioch in Syria, sitting in a house that smells like olive oil and dust. He has just come back from his first long missionary trip. He planted churches across the rough interior of what is now central Turkey, a region the Romans called Galatia. He left those churches young, raw, joyful, free. And now, sitting in Antioch, a report has arrived. Other teachers have followed him into Galatia. Jewish believers, sincere, intense, telling his converts that faith in Jesus is not enough. They have to be circumcised. They have to keep the law of Moses. They have to become Jews to become Christians. Paul picks up his pen. There is no warm greeting. There is no thank you. There is no I pray for you always. He skips the customary opening and goes straight to the throat of the matter. I am amazed, he writes, that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you. You can almost see him grip the pen harder. You can almost hear him pacing. The Greek word he opens his letters with, again and again, is doulos. It means slave. A Roman citizen, by choice, calling himself the slave of a crucified Jewish carpenter. That word is how the whole story starts. Galatians is a letter written in fire. You can hear the breath of it. He is furious, not because his pride is wounded. He is furious because the gospel he bled to bring them is being smothered. By the end of the letter, he is begging them, for freedom, Christ has set you free. Stand firm. This is the first letter. It is not a polite one. A year, maybe two, goes by. Paul is now in Corinth. It is somewhere around the year 50 or 51. He has just survived one of the most painful exits of his life. Months earlier, he had been preaching in Thessalonica in northern Greece. The synagogue erupted. A mob gathered. His host, a man named Jason, was dragged before the city officials. Paul and his friend Silas had to slip out at night. They left behind a brand new church, believers who had been Christians for maybe 3 weeks. Babies. And Paul, a man who had been beaten and stoned for the gospel, sat in Corinth and could not stop worrying about them. He smells Timothy. Timothy was young, half Jewish, half Greek, raised by his mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois, naturally shy, often sick. Paul calls him my true child in the faith. Timothy went north to check on Thessalonica, and one day Timothy walked back into Corinth with news. The church was still standing. They were still loving each other. They were still believing. Paul wept. You can picture the relief on his face when Timothy walked back through that door, and he sat down and wrote 1 Thessalonians. It is one of the gentlest things he ever wrote. He says, "We were torn away from you, brothers, for a short time, in person, not in heart." He is not torn at the body. He is torn at the heart. Here is what most people miss. Paul does not write theology in a study. He writes it on the bench, after a beating, in a city he had to flee, about a church he is afraid he will never see again. A few months later, possibly weeks, he writes again, 2 Thessalonians. The believers in Thessalonica have read his first letter and panicked. They think Jesus is coming back any day. Some have stopped working. They are sitting around waiting for the sky to crack open. Paul, lovingly, firmly, sets them straight. He says, "Look, until he comes, go to work, earn your bread, love your neighbor, eat what you grow." 3 letters down. Now we move forward in time. About 3 or 4 years. Paul is now in Ephesus, on the western coast of what is today Turkey. He has been there a long time. He is preaching in a rented lecture hall every afternoon from 11 to 4. The book of Acts says all of Asia heard the word of the Lord during this stretch. But far across the Aegean Sea, in Corinth, the city where he had once written so tenderly to Thessalonica, things are unraveling. A report arrives. Members of the Corinthian church are sleeping with each other's family members. They are suing each other in pagan courts. They are getting drunk at the Lord's Supper while their poor brothers and sisters sit hungry. They are fighting about which spiritual gifts are the best. The wealthy are humiliating the working class. The whole thing is on fire. Paul writes 1 Corinthians. It's long. It is dense. It is correction after correction after correction. For 12 chapters, he is fixing what they have broken. And then, right in the middle of the chaos, right between his correction about spiritual gifts and his correction about the resurrection, he stops. He takes a breath, and he writes 13 verses that 2,000 years later get read at most weddings on the planet. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I am only a clanging cymbal. The Greek word is agape, not romantic love, not friendship, not affection. Agape is the love that does not depend on response, the love that gives whether or not it is loved back. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not boast. You have heard the words. You have heard them at weddings. You have heard them on greeting cards. You have probably never heard them in their original context. Pay attention to this. This is not a wedding poem. This is a furious pastor writing to a broken church full of egos and lawsuits and drunkenness, and stopping mid-letter to tell them, none of your gifts, none of your knowledge, none of your eloquence matters if you do not love each other. Read in context, it is not romantic, it is surgical. 4 letters now. Galatians, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians. And here is the strange thing. He is not yet halfway through. He has not yet been arrested. He has not yet stood before kings. He has not yet been shipwrecked off Malta. He has not yet seen Rome. The next 4 letters were all written from the same place, and that place is a prison. Before we walk into that prison with him, let me say one thing. If this is hitting you the way I hope it is, if reading these letters in order is changing something for you, do me one small favor. Subscribe, hit the bell, And in the comments, tell me which of the first 4 letters you would not read the same way again. Galatians with Paul writing in fury, 1 Thessalonians with Paul writing in tears, 2 Thessalonians with Paul gently telling people to go back to work, or 1 Corinthians, where the most famous chapter on love in human history was written in the middle of a furious correction. Tell me below. I read every comment. Now, the prison. It is now the year 55, possibly 56. Paul has left Ephesus. There has been a riot in the city. Silversmiths who made tiny shrines of the goddess Artemis realized that if the gospel kept spreading, their livelihood was finished. They rioted. Paul left. He traveled north into Macedonia, and on the road, somewhere between cities, he wrote one of the most personal letters anyone in the New Testament ever wrote. 2 Corinthians. You can feel him bleeding through the page. He talks about his hardships, beaten with rods 3 times, stoned and left for dead once, shipwrecked 3 times, and this is before the famous shipwreck off Malta that has not even happened yet. Hungry, thirsty, cold, in danger from his own people, in danger from Gentiles, in danger from false brothers. And then, in the middle of it, he says something nobody asked him to say. He says he has a thorn in his flesh. He does not tell us what it is. Scholars have guessed for 2,000 years. Eye disease, malaria, a speech impediment, a specific person who would not stop tormenting him. We don't know, but Paul says he begged the Lord 3 times to take it away, and the Lord said no. My grace is sufficient for you, the voice said, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul, the great preacher, the great theologian, the great church planter, has a thorn that God will not pull out. He has to live with it, and he writes about it to a church that does not even fully trust him anymore. There is nothing about this letter that is theology in the abstract. It is one wounded pastor saying to a wandering church, I am wounded too. I bleed too, and the grace is enough. A few months later, he is in Corinth himself, sitting in the home of a man named Gaius. He is going to stay there 3 months, and in those 3 months, he writes the most carefully argued letter of his entire life to a church he has never personally visited. Novels. Novels are different from anything he had written before. The earlier letters were urgent, local, triage. You can feel the gear shift in his writing. You are no longer reading triage. You are reading at a cathedral. Verse by verse, he lays out the gospel from the ground up. Why everyone, Jew and Greek, stands guilty before God. Why God's justice and God's mercy meet at a cross. Why nothing in heaven, on earth, or under the earth can separate a person from the love of God in Christ Jesus. 1400 years later, a German monk named Martin Luther will read this letter in a small tower room, and the entire Western world will crack open. But Paul does not know any of that. Paul finishes novels. He sends it with a woman named Phoebe, a deacon from the port town of Cenchreae. He plans to take a final offering to Jerusalem and then sail west to Spain. He never gets to Spain. In Jerusalem, he is arrested in the temple courts. A mob nearly tears him apart. Roman soldiers pull him out of it. He spends 2 years in a coastal prison at Caesarea. He appeals to Caesar. He is loaded onto a ship for Rome. The ship is caught in a 14-day storm off the southern coast of Crete. They shipwreck on the island of Malta. Paul gathers sticks for a fire, and a snake bites him on the hand. The locals wait for him to drop dead. He doesn't drop dead. He spends the winter healing the sick on the island. Finally, Rome. And it is here, in his first Roman imprisonment, under house arrest in a rented home with a Roman soldier chained to him day and night, that Paul writes 4 letters in close succession. The first is Ephesians. He writes to the church he had served the longest, the church he had wept over when he said goodbye. And in this letter, with iron on his wrist, he does not write about his chains. He writes about the cosmic Christ, the Christ who is seated far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, the Christ who holds galaxies together. Paul is in chains. Paul is writing about a Lord nobody can chain. The second is Philippians. The church at Philippi was Paul's favorite. They had loved him from the day Lydia, the wealthy dye merchant in purple cloth, opened her home and her purse to him. They had supported him for years. When they heard he was in Rome, they sent a man named Epaphroditus with a financial gift and instructions to stay and serve Paul personally. Epaphroditus nearly died of illness while serving him. Paul nursed him back, sent him home, and sent this letter with him. The word joy appears in Philippians 16 times. Paul is in chains. Paul is writing about joy. Rejoice in the Lord always, he writes. I will say it again, rejoice. The third is Colossians. To a small church in a small town, Paul has never visited. The church was started by his disciple Epaphras. A strange teaching had crept in, a mixture of Jewish rituals, angel worship, and a strange early mysticism that treated the body as the enemy. Paul writes to lift their eyes higher. The fullness of God, he says, lives in Christ in a body. And then the fourth, the shortest, the strangest, 25 verses. It does not look like a theological letter at all. It is a personal favorite. Philemon. There is a runaway slave. His name is Onesimus. The name means useful in Greek. He has fled his master, a Christian named Philemon, who hosts a house church in Colossae. Somehow, in Rome, in a city of 1 million people, this runaway slave has crossed paths with the chained apostle. Somehow he has become a Christian. Somehow he has become, in Paul's own words, my very heart. And now Paul is sending him back. He is sending the slave back to the master with a letter. The Greek word Paul uses 3 times in this letter is splagna. It means bowels, guts, the deep, visceral place inside a person where the strongest feeling lives. Modern translations soften it. They say heart. But Paul didn't say heart. He said guts. He tells Philemon, this man has refreshed my guts. Receive him as you would receive me. If he owes you anything, charge it to my account. You can feel the carefulness of every line. You can feel a man trying to talk another man into something the empire would not require him to do. This is not a manifesto. This is not a political document. This is not a sermon on slavery. This is one man asking another man to do something Roman law did not require, Roman society did not expect, and the love of Christ demanded. 6 letters from prison, 4 of them written with the same chain on his wrist, and in all of them, the man on the wrong side of Roman power refuses to be the smallest thing in the room. But Paul gets out. For a few months, perhaps a year or 2, Paul is free. Tradition and the letters themselves suggest he traveled again, possibly to Spain after all, certainly back through the eastern Mediterranean. He visits the island of Crete. He leaves Titus there to pastor the new churches. He travels through Macedonia. He leaves Timothy in Ephesus to lead the church he loved most, and from somewhere on this last journey, he writes 2 more letters. The first is 1 Timothy, pastoral, practical. He calls Timothy, my true child in the faith, and walks him line by line through how to lead a church, how to choose elders, how to handle false teachers, how to honor widows, how to fight the good fight. You can hear an old soldier handing his sword to a younger one. The second is Titus, to his other spiritual son, the one on Crete. The Cretans had a reputation across the ancient Mediterranean for being liars. Paul actually quotes a Cretan poet who had said himself, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. And then Paul, with a kind of grim humor, says, this testimony is true. He tells Titus to teach, to rebuke, to encourage, to live a life that even the liars on Crete cannot deny. 12 letters now, 12. And then, in the summer of 64, Rome burns. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire eats the city. 10 of Rome's 14 districts are damaged. 3 are destroyed completely. The Emperor Nero, vain, paranoid, 26 years old, is blamed almost immediately. He needs a scapegoat. he finds one. The Roman historian Tacitus, no friend of Christians, writes about what happens next. He says Nero fastened the guilt on a class of people hated for their abominations, called Christians. He says they were torn to pieces by dogs. He says they were crucified. He says they were burned as living torches in Nero's gardens to provide light for evening parties. Tacitus, a pagan who despised the movement, was so disturbed by it that he wrote that even though the Christians were guilty in his view, the cruelty was so extreme that a feeling of pity began to arise. Into that wave of persecution, somewhere, somehow, Paul is arrested a second time. Now watch what happens next. This time there is no rented house. This time there is no soldier chained to his wrist in a furnished room. This time it is the Mamertine, a small stone dungeon under a hill near the Roman Forum. You enter through a hole in the floor. There is no door. There is barely light. The lower chamber is colder than the upper. And here, in this hole in the ground, the old man picks up the pen one more time. He writes to Timothy. And here is where the room we started in comes back into focus. The small oil lamp, the wet stone wall, the parchment across the knees, bad eyesight, the man asking his young friend to come quickly, to come before winter, to bring the cloak he had left in Troas with a man named Carpus, to bring the books, especially the parchments. This is 2 Timothy. This is the last letter Paul will ever write, and the man writing it knows it. Demas has deserted me, he writes, because he loved this present world. The same Demas who, just a few years earlier, had been listed warmly in Colossians and in Philemon as a fellow worker. He is gone. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Of all the names, Silas, Timothy, Epaphroditus, Philemon, Onesimus, Lydia, Phoebe, Gaius, only one is in the cell, the quiet physician. The man who had walked beside him through the shipwreck and the snake and the years of chains. And then Paul writes the line that has echoed in the dying rooms of believers for 2,000 years. For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. He is, by the best estimate, 3 weeks from his execution. Eusebius, the early church historian, writing about 250 years later, records the tradition. Paul was led out of Rome along the Ostian Way and beheaded with a sword on the orders of Nero. Clement of Rome, writing only 30 years after the event, close enough to have known people who knew Paul, writes that Paul, having taught righteousness to the whole world, suffered martyrdom under the rulers and went to the holy place. The cloak almost certainly never arrived. And here is where I want to stop and tell you about another man. A long time later, to different empire, same posture. In the winter of 1943 into 1944, a German pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer sits in a small cell in Tegel prison in Berlin. He writes letters by lamplight to his fiancée Maria, who he will never marry. He writes letters to his friend Eberhard. He smuggles theology out on scraps of paper. The Nazis have arrested him for resisting Hitler. He is 38 years old. On the 9th of April, 1945, 2 weeks before the Americans liberated the camp at Flossenburg, the SS hung him. The prison doctor who watched him pray that morning later wrote that he had never seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God. 2 men, 2 cells, 2 thoughts, 2,000 years apart. You can almost place the 2 lamps side by side. The pattern repeats because the gospel is the kind of thing that puts people in those cells. So here is what I want you to walk away with. 3 things. First, the 13 letters in your New Testament are not floating doctrine. They are not abstract theology dropped from a cloud. Every single one of them was written by a specific man in a specific room in a specific city in the middle of a specific crisis. Galatians from a furious afternoon in Antioch, 1 Thessalonians through tears in Corinth, 1 Corinthians from a busy season in Ephesus, novels from a quiet stay in the house of Gaius, the prison letters from a chain on his wrist in Rome, the last one from a hole in the ground beneath a Roman hill. Read them in order, and you are not reading a textbook. You are reading the biography of a man who lost everything except his mind, his pen, and his Lord. Second, the next time you open one of these letters, ask one question before you read the first verse. Ask, what was happening to him when he wrote this? Where was he sitting? What was the chain doing on his wrist? Who had just walked away? Who was still with him? This single question will change the page. The words will stop being flat. They will start to bleed. And third, this is the one I need you to feel. The man who wrote, "Rejoice in the Lord always," wrote it in chains. The man who wrote, "My grace is sufficient for you," heard those words while begging for a thorn to be removed and being told no. The man who wrote, "Love is patient, love is kind," wrote it to a church that had broken his heart. The man who wrote, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith," was, by the best estimate of historians, 3 weeks from having his head taken off with a sword on a road outside Rome. The joy in his letters is not theory. The hope in his letters is not theory. The faith in his letters is not theory. He paid for every word of it in blood. So here is my question for you, and I really do want you to answer it in the comments. Of the 13 letters, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, 1 Timothy, Titus, 2 Timothy. Which one will you read differently now that you know when he wrote it? Tell me below. I read everyone. 13 letters, one man, one Lord, and a cloak that never came home.